A young mother is bludgeoned to death in her own living room. The weapon is a baseball bat. The floorboards are soaked. Just a few feet away, her 1-year-old daughter sits quietly in a playpen, completely unharmed. Hours later, the man who swung the bat sits down for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. He passes the turkey. He bounces the toddler on his knee. Outside, sitting in the freezing November air, is a heavy black plastic tote containing the child's mother. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Woodland Park, Colorado, sits at an elevation of nearly 8,500 feet. It is a place where the air is thin, the winters are unforgiving, and privacy is merely an illusion. This is the kind of tight-knit mountain enclave where a muddy pickup truck parked in the wrong driveway becomes local gossip before noon. People move to Teller County for the isolation, or to escape the noise of the city. The towering pines and snow-capped peaks offer a picture-perfect facade of serenity. Kelsey didn't come here to hide. At 29, she arrived in the Rocky Mountains, chasing altitude and opportunity. She worked as an aviation instructor, a woman who spent her days navigating complex airspace and her evenings grounded in the quiet routines of rural life. Born and raised in Washington State, with deep family roots anchored in Idaho, Kelsey possessed a fierce, quiet independence. She wasn't one to rely on anyone else to fix her problems. Her mother, Cheryl, knew her as driven, a woman who knew exactly how to chart her own course and follow it through. Kelsey's daily life was defined by precision. Her world smelled of aviation fuel, crisp high-altitude ozone, and the stale coffee of the flight dispatch room. She commanded respect in a notoriously male-dominated field, teaching students how to recover from mid-air stalls and navigate severe turbulence. She was meticulous, highly organized, and fundamentally practical. A pilot has to be. Every pre-flight check, every calculated risk was measured to ensure a safe landing. She approached her personal life with the same methodical care. She wanted a family, a stable home, and a quiet space to build a future. But human nature is vastly more unpredictable than aerodynamics. You can't always see a storm gathering on the radar. The rugged landscape of the surrounding county produced men who prided themselves on extreme self-reliance. Patrick Frazee fit this archetype flawlessly. At 32, he operated as a local farrier and cattle rancher. He spent his days shoeing horses, mending barbed wire fences, and maintaining a stoic cowboy persona that played perfectly with the local demographic. Patrick's world smelled of burning keratin, manure, and heavy diesel. He wore the grease on his hands and the dust on his boots like a badge of honor. To the casual observer, he was a hardworking, traditional man, a quiet pillar of rural masculinity. He rarely spoke more than necessary, a trait the townspeople easily mistook for quiet strength. Underneath that carefully curated rustic exterior, the reality was cold and hollow. Frazee still lived with his mother on a sprawling, secluded 35-acre ranch in Florissant, just 15 miles west of Woodland Park. Despite the open spaces surrounding him, his mindset was rigidly confined. He demanded absolute control over his environment. The horses he broke, the iron he hammered into submission, the people he allowed into his limited orbit, everything had to yield to his specific will. Where Kelsey was open, optimistic, and ambitious, Patrick was deeply insular. He viewed the world through a strictly transactional lens. People were tools to be utilized. Relationships were not equal partnerships. They were territorial acquisitions. He possessed a terrifying capability to compartmentalize his emotions, burying a calculating, predatory nature beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a polite nod. When you place a woman who thrives on freedom and elevation next to a man obsessed with absolute ownership and control, the resulting friction is inevitable. Kelsey looked at the expansive Colorado sky and saw endless possibilities. Patrick looked at his acreage and saw borders he needed to fiercely enforce. They existed in completely different realities, sharing only geographic proximity and the thin mountain air. It was a fatal collision course masked by the mundane rhythms of country living. The aviation instructor and the farrier, one always looking up, the other focused entirely on the dirt. The initial connection did not happen at a local rodeo or a dusty feed store. It started through the sterile, artificial glow of a computer screen. In the spring of 2016, an online dating platform bridged the gap between the ambitious pilot and the reserved rancher. Digital profiles are carefully curated, designed to showcase only the most appealing angles of a life while hiding the shadows. Through text messages and brief phone calls, Patrick presented himself as a hard-working, traditional family man looking to settle down. Kelsey saw a grounded partner. She saw someone who valued sweat equity and the quiet beauty of the mountains. Drawn by the promise of a shared future, she made a massive concession. She packed up her life in Washington state, leaving behind an established support network, and moved to Teller County just to be closer to him. It was a significant leap of faith. She secured a job in Pueblo, managing a grueling commute that often stretched for hours down winding, icy highways, simply to make the geography work. But physical proximity quickly revealed the deep, jagged fractures in their compatibility. The charming cowboy she met online dissolved into an exacting, critical authoritarian. Patrick expected a woman who would fold neatly into his rigid schedule, a silent background character on his 35-acre property. Instead, he got an independent professional who earned her own paycheck, possessed her own opinions, and refused to be entirely subservient. The friction was immediate and constant. Within months of her relocation, the dynamic shifted from romantic to heavily transactional. Then came the news that permanently altered the trajectory of both their lives: an unplanned pregnancy. For Kelsey, the child was a profound blessing, a reason to double down on building a cohesive, loving family. She began nesting, buying baby gear, and envisioning a life shared under one roof. For Patrick, a baby represented a tether, an obligation that fundamentally threatened his absolute autonomy. When their daughter was born late the following year, the couple's living situation remained profoundly abnormal. Engaged but never married, they still did not share a home. The mother and newborn lived in a modest townhouse in Woodland Park. The father remained 15 miles away in Florissant, living with his own mother. He dictated the terms of this separation. He claimed his property was no place for an infant, citing the physical dangers of livestock, heavy machinery, and exposure to the extreme elements. In reality, it was a barricade. The distance allowed him to retain total control over his domain while accessing his child and his fiancée, only when it suited his schedule. Kelsey navigated the exhausting, bone-deep fatigue of single motherhood while technically wearing an engagement ring. She paid her own rent. She bought the groceries. She maintained her demanding career as an instructor, grading flight logs while the baby slept. All the while, she waited for the man she loved to step up, to finally integrate their lives. He kept her suspended in a perpetual state of emotional purgatory, offering just enough sparse affection to keep her anchored, but never enough commitment to provide genuine security. The isolation of her townhouse slowly became a psychological cage. While he kept his fiancée at arm's length, Patrick was quietly cultivating a completely separate, parallel existence. 600 miles northwest, in the high desert of Twin Falls, Idaho, lived a woman who had known him for over a decade. Crystal Lee Kenny was a divorced nurse, a mother of two, and someone who harbored a long-standing pathetic infatuation with the Colorado cowboy. Their history was a messy, unresolved tangle of brief romantic encounters and lingering emotional dependency. He knew her pressure points. He knew exactly how to exploit her deep-seated insecurities. He did not just call the Idaho nurse to catch up. He groomed her. He began weaving a dark, elaborate fiction, systematically destroying the character of his fiancée from afar. Through late-night phone calls and encrypted burner phones, he painted himself as a desperate, trapped victim. He fabricated horrific stories, claiming the mother of his child was an abusive, neglectful alcoholic who was actively, physically endangering their infant daughter. He described fictional incidents of abuse with chilling conviction. He played directly on the nurse's maternal instincts and her desperate, hollow need for his validation. The nurse swallowed the lies completely. She wanted to be his savior. She wanted to prove her ultimate loyalty, hoping that by rescuing him, she would finally win his love. The manipulation was a masterclass in coercive control. Patrick recognized that he could weaponize Crystal's blind devotion. Once he firmly established the false narrative of the unstable, dangerous fiancé, the tenor of the conversations shifted. He stopped complaining about his domestic situation and started brainstorming permanent solutions. The rhetoric turned lethal. He casually introduced the idea that the only way to protect his daughter was to eliminate the threat entirely. He asked the nurse to help him permanently resolve the issue. It wasn't a sudden, impassioned snap of rage. It was a cold, methodical brainwashing process designed to turn an insecure, middle-aged healthcare worker into a willing accomplice to a homicide. His obsession with absolute control had mutated into something monstrous. He didn't just want to avoid a messy, public custody battle or the financial burden of monthly child support. He wanted to erase the aviation instructor from the earth. He wanted the child. He wanted his unchecked freedom, and he wanted a clean slate, achieved through calculated violence. As the leaves in Teller County turned a brittle gold and the overnight temperatures began to plummet in the late fall of 2018, the trap was already fully set. Kelsey continued to decorate her townhouse, buying winter clothes for her toddler and planning a warm Thanksgiving dinner, entirely unaware that the man she planned to marry was actively crowdsourcing her execution. The digital timestamp on the surveillance video registers the mid-morning hours. The local Safeway grocery store is awash in the harsh, artificial glare of fluorescent lighting. Shoppers navigate the crowded aisles, rushing to purchase last-minute items for their holiday meals. Among them is a mother, dressed casually in a white sweater and a light scarf. She pushes a metal shopping cart. Nestled securely in the front basket is a baby carrier holding her 1-year-old daughter. The security cameras track her movements from the produce section to the checkout lanes. She buys sweet potatoes, recipe ingredients, and a few essentials. It is a completely ordinary, unremarkable holiday morning. She pays for her items, gathers her child, and walks out through the automatic sliding glass doors into the crisp, high-altitude autumn air. These grainy, silent security images mark the final public documentation of her life. She loads the groceries into her vehicle and drives back to her townhouse, preparing to host the man she still hopes to marry. Early that afternoon, a heavy pickup truck pulls into the driveway of the modest complex. The farrier steps out. He does not carry flowers. He does not carry a gift. He carries a dark, rigid agenda that has been weeks in the making. He walks through the front door. The townhouse is warm. The air is thick with the scent of baking and domestic routine. The baby is placed safely in a playpen in the center of the living room, surrounded by brightly colored plastic toys. The atmosphere between the couple is deceptively calm. There is no argument. There are no raised voices. There is no violent domestic disturbance to alert the neighbors sharing the thin adjoining walls. He relies on a terrifyingly flat, even demeanor. He needs the environment controlled. He needs his target compliant, relaxed, and positioned precisely where he wants her. He introduces a distraction. He suggests a game. He tells her he brought several different scented candles and wants her to guess the specific fragrances. It is a juvenile, slightly odd suggestion, but it is deeply disarming. It strips away any lingering tension. He instructs her to sit down on the living room floor. He produces a heavy sweater and ties it securely around her eyes, fashioning a tight, impenetrable blindfold. She sits directly on the hardwood floor, completely stripped of her primary sense. She is plunged into artificial darkness, anticipating the smell of vanilla, cinnamon, or pine. She trusts the father of her child enough to sit defenseless in her own home. She waits in the quiet room for the game to begin. The pacing of the room shatters. He does not reach for a candle. He reaches for a heavy, solid wood baseball bat. He positions himself directly behind her. The baby babbles in the playpen, situated a mere 3 feet away. He raises the heavy wood. He grips the handle. He swings. The first strike is devastating. The hollow, sickening thud of dense wood meeting bone fractures the quiet afternoon. She falls instantly. She doesn't have time to remove the sweater from her eyes. She does not have the capacity to scream. She does not have the chance to fight back or reach for her child. He steps forward. He swings again and again. The violence is kinetic, overwhelming, and absolute. The force of the repeated blows shatters her skull. The metallic, heavy tang of arterial blood instantly overpowers the smell of the holiday meal, cooking in the adjacent kitchen. It sprays in violent arcs across the beige walls. It coats the television screen. It pools heavily on the hardwood floor. Microscopic droplets mist over the baby's playpen, settling onto the plastic toys and the child's clothing. He does not stop until all movement ceases. He does not stop until the structural integrity of the human body beneath him is completely destroyed. Silence crashes back into the cramped living room. It is interrupted only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the killer, and the oblivious, soft sounds of a toddler playing just inches from the expanding pool of her mother's blood. He stands over the ruin he created. He is entirely pragmatic. There is no panic. There is no frantic pacing or display of remorse. He is a man executing a strictly defined chore. He walks directly through the heavy pooling blood, the deep treads of his heavy work boots leaving distinct crimson tracks across the floorboards. He leaves the townhouse momentarily and returns carrying a massive, heavy-duty black plastic storage tote. He brought it specifically for this exact logistical purpose. He grabs the heavy, limp weight of his fiancée. He drags her across the living room, smearing the floor, and forces her body into the dark, rigid plastic container. It is a tight fit. He has to apply physical pressure to fold her inside. He forces the lid down and snaps the plastic latches shut. The horror of the blood-soaked room is staggering, but he ignores the crimson splatter decorating the walls and ceiling. He does not intend to clean it. He has outsourced that specific task to a terrified woman waiting hundreds of miles away in Idaho. He walks into the bathroom and washes his hands. He walks back into the slaughterhouse of a living room and scoops the toddler out of the playpen, balancing the child on his hip. He grabs his keys. He drags the heavy black tote out the front door, the plastic scraping loudly against the concrete step. He hoists it over the tailgate and into the bed of his truck, sliding it alongside his farrier tools, his ropes, and his heavy equipment. He opens the rear passenger door and secures the baby in her car seat. He climbs behind the wheel and starts the engine. He drives the 15 miles back to his mother's ranch in Florissant. The afternoon sun begins to dip below the mountain ridge, casting long shadows across the icy asphalt. He parks the truck. He unbuckles his daughter, walks inside the warm house, and sits down at a dining table laden with roasted turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. He is surrounded by his extended family. He smiles. He bows his head. He gives thanks for the meal. Outside, the mountain temperature rapidly drops below freezing, and the black plastic tote sits silently in the bed of his pickup truck. Then, a digital ghost appeared. On November 25th, 3 days after the fatal strike in the living room, a brief series of text messages originated from the missing woman's cell phone. One pinged the dispatch office at her aviation employer. The message bluntly stated she would not be coming into work for the upcoming week. Another text was sent to the farrier, claiming she was traveling out of state to check on her grandmother. The phrasing was entirely wrong. It lacked her usual cadence, her specific, familiar syntax. It was stilted, hollow, and alarmingly brief. It did not read like the communications of a meticulous aviation instructor responsible for complex flight schedules. It read like a crude impersonation. Technology leaves an indelible footprint. When law enforcement eventually pulled the cellular data, they discovered a geographic anomaly that defied all logic. The Sunday text messages did not originate from the high altitudes of Colorado. The cellular ping registered off a tower in Gooding, Idaho, nearly 600 miles northwest of Woodland Park. It was a grueling 10-hour drive across desolate state lines. The physical logistics simply did not align. How could a mother, supposedly walking away from her life, traverse 3 states without her vehicles? Both her cars remained parked, frozen and stationary, in the driveway of her complex. The police executed a formal welfare check at the townhouse. Officers breached the front door and stepped into a space that felt less like a home and more like a vacuum. The ambient temperature was cold. The air held the faint, stale scent of untouched cinnamon rolls resting on the kitchen counter. Her luggage, her makeup bag, her purse, all vanished. Yet the scene completely lacked the chaotic debris of a sudden flight or a violent struggle. The living room floor was immaculately clean, too clean. It smelled faintly of harsh chemical solvents, masking the metallic odor of violence that had saturated the room just days prior. The visual emptiness was deeply unsettling to the responding officers. The baby's brightly colored toys sat perfectly aligned in the playpen, completely undisturbed. People do not simply evaporate, leaving behind a cold oven and perfectly staged furniture. Teller County fractured under the weight of the disappearance. The quiet, idyllic mountain sanctuary dissolved into a landscape of paranoia. Faded missing person posters plastered every available surface, taped to the glass doors of the local Safeway, pinned to telephone poles along the icy highways, stacked by the registers of the hardware store. The brittle winter wind tore at the edges of the paper. In the grocery aisles and the coffee shops, the whispers grew louder. A professional woman does not abandon a 1-year-old child to vanish into the frozen wilderness. The physical search was daunting. Pike National Forest spans over 1 million acres of dense pine, jagged ravines, and unforgiving terrain. Search and rescue teams deployed K-9 units. Helicopters swept low over the tree line, scanning for any disruption in the snowpack. Every passing snowstorm threatened to bury potential evidence under feet of fresh powder. The community looked at their neighbors with newfound suspicion. The isolation of the mountains, once a major selling point for the residents, suddenly felt like a massive, impenetrable trap. Everyone knew everyone, which meant someone was lying. As the physical search intensified, a glaring void materialized at the center of the investigation. In December, the local police department held a highly publicized press conference. Cheryl stood before the flashing cameras, her voice breaking, pleading with the public for any information regarding her child. She stood entirely alone. The father of the missing woman's baby, the man who claimed to love her, refused to attend. His absence from the podium was deafening. It resonated through the community faster than any rumor. A desperate family mounts a public campaign. A guilty conscience stays off camera. When investigators finally sat across from him in the interrogation room, he presented a perfectly constructed wall of apathy. His demeanor was heavily guarded, his posture relaxed but completely unyielding. He offered a clean, emotionally barren narrative. He claimed the relationship had simply run its course. According to his official statement, they met on Thanksgiving Day, agreed to formally separate, and she willingly handed over the baby, her keys, and her firearm. He told the detectives she simply walked out the door and vanished, abandoning her entire life without a single backward glance. He presented this story not as a tragedy, but as a bureaucratic domestic dissolution. He offered no theories regarding her whereabouts. He offered no assistance to the search parties. He simply crossed his arms and let the silence hang in the interrogation room, confident that the immense Colorado wilderness would keep his secret, and absolute in his belief that the absence of a body equated to the absence of a crime. The Gooding, Idaho cell tower ping was the fatal miscalculation. A perpetrator can scrub a hardwood floor until it shines, but they cannot erase the invisible architecture of cellular telemetry. Agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI abandoned the physical grid of Pike National Forest and pivoted entirely to the digital one. They subpoenaed the cellular data for the farrier's primary device. The records revealed a frantic, convoluted web of communication. He was not merely using his registered smartphone. He had activated multiple prepaid burner devices, purchasing them with cash and swapping them out in a clumsy attempt at operational security. He believed he was untraceable, but he made the fundamental error of carrying his active primary phone in his pocket, right alongside the burners. The telecommunication towers tracked the devices moving in perfect tandem down the local highways. Every single digital thread he spun over the preceding weeks led back to one specific node located in the high desert of Twin Falls, Idaho. The registered owner of that connecting number was Crystal Lee Kenny. Detectives traveled northwest, crossing state lines to confront the nurse in her own jurisdiction. They cornered her in a sterile, windowless interview room. Initially, she deployed the exact defensive narrative she had been programmed to deliver. She offered vague denials, feigning complete ignorance regarding the missing aviation instructor. But federal agents do not negotiate with proxies. They systematically dismantled her cover story. They placed the physical documentation on the metal table, the corresponding cell tower pings tracking her specific phone traveling down the interstate from Idaho to Colorado immediately following the Thanksgiving holiday. They mapped out the precise timestamps of the burner phone activity. The psychological pressure applied in that room was suffocating. The investigators isolated her, deliberately severing the emotional tether she maintained with the cowboy in Colorado. They outlined the severe federal penalties for accessory to murder. They reminded her that she had her own children to consider, children who would grow up without a mother if she absorbed the legal impact of his crime. The illusion of a romantic rescue dissolved into the stark, fluorescent reality of a lengthy prison sentence. The man she idolized was not coming to save her. He had positioned her as the perfect, expendable scapegoat. The facade completely shattered. The nurse began to speak, offering a blueprint of calculated depravity. She told the investigators she did not swing the baseball bat, but she was recruited to be the janitor. On November 24th, 2 days after the blunt force trauma in the living room, she received the final summons. She made the 10-hour drive south through a severe winter storm, navigating the icy passes of the Rocky Mountains. Her vehicle was loaded with an inventory of destruction: industrial bleach, heavy-duty rubber gloves, protective hairnets, and thick trash bags. She detailed her entry into the Woodland Park townhouse. The reality of the crime scene eclipsed the fabricated stories she had been fed. The violence had been absolute. She described a space completely saturated in human biological material. Crimson splatter coated the beige walls, pooled heavily beneath the sofa, and misted across the blades of the ceiling fans. It was baked into the grout of the faux stone fireplace. For hours, a trained healthcare worker systematically erased the biological existence of the mother. She scrubbed the baseboards. She wiped down the brightly colored plastic toys sitting in the playpen. The enclosed space smelled overwhelmingly of caustic industrial bleach, fighting against the heavy, metallic stench of oxidizing copper. She found fragments of the victim's teeth scattered across the hardwood and flushed them down the toilet. She collected the blood-soaked throw pillows, the ruined rugs, and a plush stuffed animal, shoving them into the heavy garbage bags. She worked until her hands blistered, stopping only when the surface layer of the apartment appeared completely pristine. Armed with this precise, horrifying intelligence, crime scene technicians returned to the seemingly immaculate condo. They no longer trusted the visual surface. They deployed chemical reagents, specialized ultraviolet lighting, and heavy crowbars. They physically dismantled the living room. When they pulled up the hardwood planks, the chemical spray reacted violently in the dark. Beneath the floorboards, settling deep in the narrow, inaccessible crevices between the wooden joists where a mop and bleach could not penetrate, they found it. Microscopic traces of human tissue and blood. The subsequent DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to the missing woman. The lingering theory of an abrupt, voluntary disappearance was definitively incinerated. The townhouse was officially reclassified as a homicide scene. The nurse's timeline pushed the investigation forward into the cold logistics of the cover-up. She directed law enforcement to Nash Ranch, a sprawling, secluded property in Florissant, where Patrick stored equipment and ran cattle. She recounted arriving at the ranch to find him operating a heavy front-end loader. He had retrieved the heavy black plastic storage tote from a stack of hay where it had been hidden since Thanksgiving afternoon. He used the tractor to transport the heavy container to an open dirt depression on the property. She stood by in the freezing mountain air and watched as he arranged the cordwood. He placed the heavy tote directly onto the pile. He added the garbage bags filled with the blood-soaked rugs, the pillows, and the cleaning supplies from the townhouse. He saturated the entire mound in liquid accelerant. He ignited the pile. The fire burned violently, the flames reaching high into the winter sky. She described the thick, black, toxic smoke rolling off the burn pit as the industrial plastic melted down. The smell of gasoline, combined with incinerating organic matter, permeated the rural landscape. As the fire consumed the evidence, the farrier remained completely detached. He used a heavy metal rake to churn the coals, ensuring the core temperature remained high enough to compromise dense bone. When the fire finally burned down to gray ash, he shoveled the remains into fresh garbage bags. He would later dispose of them in a commercial dumpster, erasing the final physical traces of his fiancée. Standing next to the smoldering pit, he casually handed the dead woman's cellular device to the nurse. He issued strict instructions to drive the phone back to Idaho and fire off the decoy text messages to her employer. A final, calculated maneuver to stall the inevitable search. The methodical dismantling of the alibi was complete. The digital data, the biological residue beneath the floorboards, and a cooperating accomplice formed an inescapable net. The quiet, stoic rancher had spent weeks digging a grave, entirely unaware that the authorities were already standing at the edge of it. The trial commenced in late 2019, overwhelming the small Teller County courthouse. Patrick sat at the defense table with the same rigid, expressionless posture he maintained on his ranch. He anticipated a weak circumstantial case. He was wrong. The prosecution systematically buried him under a mountain of digital telemetry and microscopic biology. The definitive turning point arrived when the Idaho nurse took the stand. She laid out the entire conspiracy in grueling detail, from the initial psychological grooming to the horrific cleanup and the destruction of the black tote. The defense scrambled to dismantle her credibility, framing her as a desperate accomplice lying to secure a plea deal. But her narrative perfectly matched the forensic reality. The invisible blood and the synchronized cellular tracking could not be cross-examined. It took the jury less than 4 hours to shatter the defendant's facade. They returned a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years. The man who obsessed over boundaries and dominance was permanently stripped of the one thing he valued above all else, his absolute control. The gated acreage in Cherokee County is quiet once again, but the heavy silence that blankets the property is no longer a symbol of peace. It is the echo of total, irreversible ruin. A sprawling farm, originally purchased to build a lasting legacy, ultimately served as a slaughterhouse and a makeshift crematorium. A brilliant mind was reduced to fragments of bone, all to satisfy a horrific, calculated greed. The land endures, but a family was completely incinerated from the inside out. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.